Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Writing and Narrative Design panel of SGDA's 2023 Summit. The speakers that have kindly put aside time to answer our questions today are Emily Pitcher, Elizabeth Below, Andrea Saravia Perez, and Katie Mallon, a writer at Turtle Rock Studios, who will join us later at 3 p.m. for audience questions. I'm Nicolette Bond, an SGDA officer and UCLA student, and I will be moderating this panel today. I will be asking a series of prepared questions for the first 30 minutes, and feel free to pitch in if you have an answer that you would like to add on or you would like to add on to what someone else says. And in the last 20 minutes, there will be audience questions or more of my own questions, depending on how many audience questions we get. And finally, would you be able to introduce yourselves with your name, pronouns, experience, and anything else you'd like us to know about you? Emily, did you want to start?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Emily. My pronouns are she, her. I am a writer and narrative designer based in Los Angeles. I'm the founder of Sondering Studio. We are an indie game studio creating heartfelt narrative games with a focus on Asian American representation, and we're currently part of Xbox's Developer Acceleration Program. Outside of writing, I am also a game development content creator. I make short form videos on Instagram and starting to make videos on YouTube, and I make videos about game dev, my favorite indie games, and the occasional meme. I've been featured in Polygon, the Game Awards feature class, and Code Coven's Solstice program. That's it from me.
And any of you guys can continue because we'll probably go around to each speaker.
Um, I can go next. My name's Andrea Soraya Perez, and I am a game writer, narrative designer, and quest designer from Colombia. I have over 5 years of experience in the game industry. Most recently, I was a writer at Pirates Games. Additionally, I've also been working with organizations like Latinos in Gaming, Tan Grande Jugando, to mentor and help aspiring narrative designers and game developers from Latin America. It's nice to meet everyone digitally.
All right. Hey everyone. My name is Elizabeth. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently a narrative designer at Deck9 Games in Denver, Colorado, which is where I live. And I previously worked on the game Wildflowers by Studio Drydock, as well as several games for Toya Play in conjunction with Dove about women's body image. I've been an adjunct instructor at the New School and NYU in New York City, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Endgame Sequences, which is an anthology of writing and illustrations about the portrayal of death, grief, and grieving rituals in video games.
Wow. Yeah, those are all really cool. Thank you guys for letting us know a little bit about yourselves. And I'll start with the first question. Narrative design has a lot of meanings for a lot of people, ranging from writing dialogue and characters to advocating for the story. How would you describe what you do as writers and narrative designers?
Does anyone? I'm happy to go first, but I don't want to step on anyone's toes.
I'll go second.
Okay.
Third.
Okay, wonderful. Wow, that was so easy. Yeah, so that's a really good question because I think that everyone defines narrative design and games writing a little bit differently. Um, it is different depending on the studio, and then within studios, individuals can have varying responsibilities. So I kind of think of narrative design as primarily what I do. So the way that I kind of think of it is, games writing is like the creation of the actual text, whether that's dialogue, cutscene, barks, codex entries, flavor text, that kind of thing. And then narrative design is like the creation of the systems that we have at our disposal to use all of those tools. So I kind of think of it like, when you create custom dice, you have the material that you pour into the dice molds, but then you actually have to create the dice molds themselves. Like you have to decide whether you're going to make a D4 or a D6 or a D20. Or like what if there's really massive D20s that fits in the palm of your hand or something like that. So narrative design is kind of like creating the mold and deciding what die you're going to make. And then games writing is kind of like creating the resin composite that you're going to pour into it, what it looks like, what's inside it, that kind of thing.
As for me, so Sonic Studio, I would say, is a narrative first studio, meaning that we base our game mechanics or our music off the narrative. So for me, I do all of the writing. I write all the dialogue in the game. I'm the only writer for because we're a small studio. And then as for narrative design, what I do is I will like write an outline of the story and have big narrative beats, pick like a mood for that. So like it's happy, it's sad, it's stressful. And then I will work with the level design team in making sure that the level design hits those narrative beats. So for example, in my next game that I'm working on, if there's a scene that is really stressful, maybe the level design team will make platforms that break, platforms that shake, really, really fast-paced level design, right? So I collaborate with those teams to make sure that we're building a cohesive mood that matches the narrative.
I definitely agree with the definition that Elizabeth provided of like, obviously like, I love the example of the die so much, of like, writer versus narrative designer. And then I think like it also depends like what narrative design means to me may be different than what narrative design means in the context of AAA and in the context of indie, because I feel like right now I'm working on a personal project where like I'm doing narrative design, and we're also sort of like focusing on the narrative as like the pillar per se of the game. And I would talk to not just like the artists but also the sound designers like, hey, I want this to, I want the environmental storytelling to be like this. I want there to be cobwebs. I want there to be abandonment and like these different like narrative concepts that I want different departments to convey. So that's sort of like how I would like implement narrative design in the a project that we have, the Power Band project right now. But there's times where like in especially like when applying to jobs where that's not the definition of narrative design. So a technical narrative designer is different than a narrative designer, different than a narrative director, different than a narrative manager. So for to figure out the meaning of narrative design, I would really recommend people to like look at the job listing and see what are they requiring to do. Like, is the job listing only stating like writer things, or do they want you to also implement? Do they want you to use the engines? Sorry if that was like a deviation of the question. I hope that answered it.
No, that was not a deviation at all. It's definitely good advice to have us make sure that we're not just saying narrative design and just assuming one thing, and we're really looking at the listing very closely. Um, and I want to ask this question since I always get a different answer from a lot of people. So, and especially as they talk about their own journeys to where they are in their career. So, since different companies require different skill sets for narrative designers, is there a right way to prepare for the career? And how did you prepare?
I can go first with this one. As for me, how I prepared is like honestly, I think that the vast majority of my game development skills just came from doing a ton of game jams. I never studied games in college, but I was very, very interested in game development. So I joined my college's game dev club in my junior year. And for me, like what allowed me to learn about the fundamentals of game writing, specifically the fact that game writing is usually interactive while other forms aren't, is just making a ton of small games that also allows me to experiment with different types of stories to see which one might be my specialty, what types of characters I enjoy writing. So doing that, I would practice writing barks. For those who don't know, barks are like really short one-line dialogue. So like in a game like League of Legends, when a character does an ult, they might say like, take that, or I'm gonna get you, like, trying to write barks, working in a bunch of small projects. And as for me, like my biggest challenge for preparing for a game writing role is writing dialogue. But before doing game writing, I wrote no dialogue whatsoever. I had a poetry writing background. So my inclination was to make the dialogue sound like poetry, but then the dialogue doesn't even sound realistic to how humans sound. So one tip I have for that is if you're also new to dialogue writing and you want it to make it sound realistic, I actually like to talk when I write. I'll say it out loud to see if the flow sounds right. And then when I'm done, I'll have my friend or someone read it out loud. And if I cringe, that means it didn't sound realistic. And I'll literally mark it as a place that I need to fix.
Yeah, I really like the advice of joining game jams. I think that's great. And if you don't know where to find game jams, you can go to itch.io. They have a whole list of game jams that are happening. A lot of them are public. You don't have to know anyone who's participating. A lot of the time you can just get matched up with other people who may not be joining with friends. And then depending on where you live, your city may have a game design and development Discord that does game jams. I know in my hometown of Richmond, which is not even a huge, game design hub, there's still a game design Discord where people will work on little projects together, and do game jams and that kind of thing. Another thing, just in general, I really don't think there's one way to prepare for being a narrative designer. And I think if anyone tells you that there's only one way, they probably are looking at this a little bit narrowly. But there are some things that you can learn that can be really useful. And one thing that I would recommend is just get really used to using variables. So you can do that in basically any kind of game design software, whether that is Twine, Ink, RenPy. Just get used to working with really simple variables like a Boolean, for example, which is whether something is true or false. So like if you've picked up the key, this variable is set to true, and then you can unlock the door. And if it's false, then you don't get to progress to the next part. That's a huge, like, that's the foundational block of a lot of what narrative design is thinking about all of the conditionals and like when a specific scene or part of the narrative can trigger. So it can be really useful to say that you're able to work with basic variables.
Variables are definitely a thing. I actually kept saying Rempy in my head the entire time until today. So thank you, Elizabeth.
I actually don't know if I'm right. I don't know.
Is it Rempy or Rempy? I'm having a crisis now.
I don't know either.
So I really recommend using those for practice though. Like Rempy or Twine are great. The way that I personally prepared for like narrative design was kind of like all over the place, where I went to college for creative writing and they had game writing classes and advanced game writing. So I took those classes and realized, wait, I like video games and writing. Why not just do both? So whenever I came across a job listing and they had, for example, like Unreal Engine is a bonus, Unity is a bonus, I would just create like a new LinkedIn account and then use like the premium, watch one of those, and then like try to like get those certifications. Um, Not only to like, because I love learning new things, so I definitely enjoyed sort of like preparing throughout college and getting as many certifications of, because I also did like a lot of game jams while in college, and I'm actually doing one right now. And I always wonder, okay, I can help with the story as a writer. How, like, what systems can I bring as a narrative designer, and what skills do I need to provide those systems for the team? And once I knew the answer, I would just sort of like start getting like those licenses. Coursera is another great place. Edits has a free stuff as well. I'm not sponsored by any of them. It's just sort of like sources that help. And I think the one that helped me absolutely the most, hands down, though, is the game writing master class held by Susan O'Connor at the narrative department, where it just touches on everything. Like it touches on how to write characters, dialogue, elevator pitch, arcs, anything that you can think of, either in like an indie scale or AAA. She covers it like throughout the class. And you also get like a great alumni network where like if somebody knows of a writing gig, they would sort of like let you know. So I highly recommend that, not only to prepare, but also to just like make friends that also like writing games, because there's no one right way. I'm just sort of like sharing what helped me, but I know people who are in narrative design, but they have a background as an insights analyst, or they have a background as, there's one who was a massage therapist. So really just sort of like wonder to yourself, like, how do I make games that I like? and whatever the response is. If you like narrative heavy games that focus on psychology, maybe take a psychology course for free. Or if you like philosophy, again, just sort of like almost like making a mosaic out of like things that you like, so you develop that career and that path that you're going to like in the long run.
Thank you for your detailed answers and all the resources too. I will definitely make sure to write those down once I rewatch the stream once it's posted.
Yeah, I can also send a document like forever with like the resources to everyone.
Yeah, that would be really nice. And then we can also share that with the people in the Discord as well once this is over.
Wait, I also want to do a quick plug, but I am hosting a game jam in August 4th to 6th. I haven't announced it yet, but that's going to be the date. So if anyone, yeah, I just gave the advice about game jams. If anyone wants to participate in one, you can participate in mine.
Can I sign up now? Thank you.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm probably gonna ask the next question. Within what you are permitted to share, what are some projects that you've worked on or are working on, and what are you doing for those projects?
So right now I'm working in a game jam, like I mentioned, the Green Light game jam, and we're in the concept phase of developing a game based on the Pangorban poem, which is a poem that an Irish monk, sorry, wrote on in the 800s about his white cat. So we added like fantasy elements to it and developed like an interactive story. And I've done research on like Irish magic. I've gone down the JSTOR rabbit hole, just really sort of like seeing like what was magic like for them, and also what the monasteries were like. And it's just trying to explore like getting the head of like the monk character and see, okay, what would his day be like? What is taking a cat during like 800s Ireland like? So definitely a lot of research that I think that I share with the team later. Like if I came across an academic paper about what Irish music was like back then, and I shared it with the sound designer. I came across what the abbeys were like and the monasteries were like in Ireland back then, so I shared it with like the art team. So just sort of like going all over JSTOR and yeah, right now it's just like researching, but I've completed like Barks and also like the general plot outline is solid.
Yeah, so the current project that I'm working on is under NDA. I so wish that I could talk about it, but I cannot. But the last project that I worked on is Wildflowers, which is a farming game with a really strong narrative component about a woman named Tara who moves to an island where her grandmother lives to help her with her farm. And then she discovers that not only is her grandmother a witch, but that she's a witch too. And so I was one of the narrative designers on that game. And I loved working on that game with Desiree, who was the lead narrative designer, and who is still there. At Studio Dry Dock, and has been working on the DLC for it, which is excellent, and I highly recommend it. But a lot of what we did on that game was before I joined, Desiree had broken out all of the bios for each of the characters. And then right around the time that I joined, we were trying to figure out what the breakdown was for each season of the game, for a character development, like when would we find out specific plot pieces of information about each character, what would the quests be, and how would the quests tie in with things like which crops could you farm that season, how with the resource system of the game, how are you going to harvest crops and then sync them back into the game system, so that you were actually doing things with the crops that you created. And so a lot of what we did was writing out the dialogue, designing the quests, and then we would swap what we had written, edit each other's work, and then we would implement it in a custom language based on Python that our technical director made. So we would implement that in Unity. And then we did lots of other small things, like we sat in on all of the voice capture sessions, which was so fun. One of my favorite parts of the job. And then once the animator created an animation system, we would go in for some of the quests and cutscenes, and we would splice together a bunch of different animations to match up with the emotions that we wanted for those scenes, which was also a really fun crash course in how animations work.
My game is NDA also, so I can't say anything about it. But it's like similar vibes to the last game that I made, so I'll just like quickly give a blurb about that. Last game I made is called The Taste of the Past, and it's about a young girl overcoming the passing of her mother through cooking Chinese food. So like my current game is also like Chinese representation, like coming of age, complicated family, those type of motifs.
Thank you for giving us a little bit of insight and also paying attention to those NDAs. um, totally respect that. Let's see. For the next one, what does the writing process? Oh, hopefully my volume is not too loud, by the way, I changed it. But what does the writing process look like for creating a character or level or scene?
Um, oh, go ahead, Andrea, you were first.
I think it depends a lot because there's a lot of, for example, if the game is based around the character, then I would sort of like get into their head first and sort of like um try to like imagine a lot of hypotheticals like what kind of coffee does this character drink in the morning? Somebody who drinks an Americano is different than somebody who has a caramel macchiato with 2 shots of espresso, 3 shots of vanilla syrup. You know, like they have a different vibe. So just sort of like really getting to like the mentality and psyche of the character first, and then the rest just kind of like flows naturally, kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons character sheet. Um, Key things that I look for, like whenever I'm writing a character, it's like what's their name, what's their race, nationality, what's their bio, what did they do before the game, what are they doing during the game, what are their goals, objectives, strengths, weaknesses, anything that you can figure out, you write it down in whatever format is comfortable for you. Sometimes I use Miro, sometimes I use Google Docs, whatever is the most handy. Then for environments, it's fascinating because like what I'm doing right now is really just going through like a lot of academic journals to investigate like what a monastery is like, looking at YouTube videos and really like trying to like find translations that are accurate of the writings that the monks did during like while they were at monasteries. What were they writing about? When they wrote about their day, what was it like? And if so, what does a monastery have? And then I would sync up with like the 3D artists, like, hey, I found this about a monastery. I found that they have an abbey. I found that they have a chapel. I found that this is what happened. So maybe we can design, you know, a place that where clearly they're praying, or clearly this is a place for eating. That sort of stuff is what so just a lot of research, then writing it and sharing it either in Miro, Google Docs, sending it to the person who's focused on it more.
I just want to say I love that the process that you're doing right now is so research heavy. That's one of my favorite parts. Is when you're like really deep in research. Um, so the game that I'm working on right now is under NDA, but I can talk a little bit about the process of creating scenes for it because it's kind of the same no matter which game at my studio is being created. So on the game that I'm currently working on, we are divided into writers, narrative designers, and then gameplay designers. And so what will generally happen for the creation of a scene is that the narrative director will write a really short summary of what needs to happen in the scene. And then I will get paired with a writer and a gameplay designer on that scene. So the first thing that I do is I work really, really closely with the writers. So the writer and I will sit down and come up with a much longer outline. So the writer will focus on things like what's the dialogue and the cutscenes going to look like? What pieces of information are we going to learn about each character? Whereas I'm thinking of things like what are the player's verbs in this scene? Where are they going to go within the scene to progress it? What is critical paths, or what does the player have to do versus what is optional in the scene? Then, after we have a draft of the scene to present to the gameplay designer, we will go to them. And then if there are things in a scene like there's a puzzle, the gameplay designer will give we might have some ideas for that. And then the gameplay designer will be like, okay, here's how we can refine it to make this into, a puzzle that's neither too hard nor too easy. And then the gameplay designer has a really good understanding of the actual layout of the level. So like, how do we scatter things throughout the scene so that not everything that you need is all clumped up together in one corner and then there's nothing in the rest of the scene. So that's the basic process that we go through in order to write the scenes. And we usually go through about 2 to 3 rounds of drafts, and the leads in all the other departments weigh in and they voice their concerns about what might be too hard for their department to do or what they really like and are looking forward to their department doing. So yeah, that's about how it goes.
As for me, how my process is in creating a character, I used to do complex character sheets for every person where I list like the music that they like, their identity, like just like every single facet, idiosyncrasy of their personality. But now I take much different approach. I focus on what does the player want and why can't they get it? And then I'll base everything about their identity on this central conflict on why they can't get what they want. As for my process for writing a scene, I will usually do like three to four drafts. My first draft is getting the ideas across. Usually like this draft will sound like ChatGPT, just like generic, just like this character feels this way, that character feels that way. This is how the relationship changes. My second draft is when I will add nuance. So I'll add greater specificity. So if a character says, I'm excited, I'll take that out and usually write something that's like, I feel like it's the night before a field trip and I'm so there's so much anticipation I can't sleep. Like something that just like, adds more depth to the character. But then my third rewrite is I probably added too much of that. So then I'll like go back and humanize a lot of my writing. And then the fourth draft is just like any last words that hang me up or the flow of a sentence I don't really like. That's how I write a scene.
It's interesting how different each of these approaches were. And the want versus need for like Emily, and then the how close you go and probably communicate with game designers for Elizabeth. So I should probably ask one more question before we get to audience questions. Let's see, which one do I want to pick? Okay. How do you write to perspectives or cultures that you haven't experienced firsthand? For example, if you had to write about Chinese history, but you have little to no prior knowledge, how would you go about doing that?
Wait, I have strong feelings about this one. So I'll go first.
Okay.
Okay. And like, okay, so I make games about being Chinese and I'm Chinese. So obviously I don't have that problem, right? Because I am from that culture. But there are a lot of games that borrow from Asian culture, but then all of the developers are not from that culture. And a lot of the times, I don't think they really get it right, or they just try to use the aesthetics of that culture. And this is like what I just wish they did is involve people of that culture. Like, yes, you can do research online, and you could get some context that way, but you should have like a consultant, right? To make sure, or a sensitivity beta reader. Just having them in the process to make sure that you're being respectful. If games just did that, I think that so many problems would be erased because you can't just read things online. You need someone of that culture to give you that context. Maybe they're saying the same things, but like they're the ones of that culture. So like even if they're saying the same thing, they can give you advice about how to portray what you want to do.
Yeah, that's a great answer. This is something that I feel very strongly about also. And I also want to acknowledge that if you are working at a studio as a junior associate or mid-rank narrative designer or writer, you may be in a position where you are asked to write about a character, and you do not have that background or that experience. And so that can be a really difficult situation because it's like, okay, I don't necessarily have the power to like demand that we hire a cultural consultant, and I'm not involved in the hiring process. So I can't say that we should hire someone of this background, which, as Emily said, is the thing that should have been done in the first place, is trying to make sure that someone from that background is hired for a project where, you know, in identity is going to be like a key part of a main character or the setting of the game. But what you can do is try to make an argument as to why having things like cultural consultants, or maybe even if you have the budget, trying to hire a writer or designer from that background, is that in general it's going to enrich the game. Like, it's going to make the experience so much more authentic. And it is also way less likely to be harmful, to hurt people by perpetuating stereotypes. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that, like, it can be hard depending on the position that you're in and how much authority you have in a studio. But I think it's possible to try to make an argument as to why cultural consultants should be involved in the process. And then if you are in the lucky position where you can make those decisions, budget it from the beginning, whether it's hiring someone from that background, or it is hiring a cultural consultant. And if it is a cultural consultant, involve them from the beginning. Do not just come to them with your script at the end of the game where you've already started doing, you know, VO or motion capture. Try to make sure that any feedback that your cultural consultants give you can actually be implemented, and it's not just a subtractive process where you're removing things because you can no longer change them, but you're adding things that the person says, hey, it would be much better and more authentic if you were to add, say, a mention of this or like that plot point. So yeah, this is definitely, this is a great question, and something that I think all writers and narrative designers should be thinking about.
I definitely have strong feelings about the subject as well. In the context of the publishing and writing for novels and books, we actually had a talk about this a couple of years ago, because there was a book that was written by an American woman about the experience of an immigrant crossing the border, and it didn't capture a lot of things correctly. So I think my sentiment back then is similar to my sentiment now, which is obviously, like, if it's the early stages, look for a sensitivity reader, or a beta tester of that culture. If it's early enough in the production, try to like have someone from that culture and then like community be a part of the development of the game, because people from that community will notice immediately whenever there's not someone of that group participating in the production. There's been a lot of amazing games that have Latina characters, but I can definitely tell when they just kind of like took excerpts from like popular mainstream media and not actual Latinas. Um, so I would definitely recommend looking into sensitivity reading, researching as much as you can, not just like in English, but like if you can find like a trans like if you're, for example, writing a Latino character and you're not Latino, then maybe like look for articles in Spanish and then translate them rather than going to Wikipedia in English immediately, because there's a lot of context that can be like missed or just like erased between translations. That's sort of like the community that I'm familiar with, and I would definitely like recommend people to just be very aware and take care of the story, if possible, and just like involve others and learn something new. And also the addition mentality that Elizabeth mentioned, very, very important to just like add something rather than like, oh, by the way, we're gonna release this tomorrow. Can you like play it real quick? Because at by that point, like, why?
It's so nice to hear that you all are so passionate about this, so that there's people working in the industry to prevent incorrect portrayals, and it's just really good to hear that all of your I completely agree with all of your outlooks on that. And so do people in the chat. All right, so I will start reading off audience questions. And the first one is from Solid Parker. They say, thank you for sharing your insight on what defining on the definition of narrative design. I want to save my question about what narrative designs would entail for each type of game. I imagine that part of it involves letting the game's world speak for itself through the player's interaction with it. Could you tell me your favorite game mechanic to use to tell a story?
I have an answer for this one. So this is like my favorite game of all time, actually. It's Before Your Eyes. It has a very unique mechanic because it's actually through your real life blinking. So it uses your webcam, and when you blink, it tracks that, and you can blink to make choices and to progress the story. So the story is about a young boy who is at a ferryman who's essentially about to present this like young boy's case to God, whether he should go to heaven or hell. And so to do that, we need to go through that boy's memories from like beginning to end to craft the perfect story to present. And every time you blink, it jumps to a new scene in that boy's life. I just love how that game uses the blink mechanic. Like it doesn't just feel gimmicky, it really adds to the story. I also think it's creative because in certain parts of the game, you have to keep your eyes closed or you have to keep your eyes open for a longer period than necessary. And the message of the game is that life flashes before your eyes. And so to have your literal eyes be in the mechanic, oh, it's genius. You should play the game. It goes on sale on Steam too. It's also on PlayStation VR and Netflix games. So check it out.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier a lot of narrative design is figuring out what verbs the player has at their disposal, and then how they use those verbs and build upon them in subsequent scenes. And so one of my favorite games and ways to use verbs kind of unconventionally is the game Unpacking. If anyone has played that, it is a game in which your only verb pretty much is unpack boxes. There are no cutscenes, there are no barks, there is no codex. A lot of the traditional forms and tools at your disposal for telling a story just aren't there. All you have are these boxes that you're unpacking, and as you move from puzzle to puzzle, because you're trying to fit all the objects in a living space, it's the same person moving from apartment to house, and you learn things about their life as they go. You see what objects they take with them from place to place. You see, their living space like expand and contract based on who they're living with. And it's just a really genius way of using a single verb, which is unpack a box, to tell a story about a character that uses almost no words. I hope that one day I'm able to come up with something even half as genius as that. It's so smart.
It's very difficult to like. I agree with Emily and Elizabeth's example. They're great games. Definitely check them out. I'm trying to figure out, even though I have a degree in writing, how to explain immortality because that's a game whose narrative I definitely enjoyed. Um, for background, like I have a minor in film studies, so in immortality, you are observing, you're following like a film star, and I think her movies were not released, so it's like you get to like see the footage and then kind of like go back. So just this mechanic of like being able to interact with the film, and then the angles are like the characters just like looking at you, the player, just create like this very intimate narrative that I haven't been able to like see replicated. But yeah, definitely like because I mean when I don't know. I feel like when editing like films, there's definitely like that moment where like you feel like you're having something with like just like the screen, like when you like notice something's really good. And Immortality just takes it to like a whole new level. And I wish I could talk more about it, but I really, really want people to play it. Like it's there's a reason it has so many accolades. Anything by like Half Mermaid, it's amazing narrative wise.
Thank you for all those game suggestions. I'll definitely be looking for them because I needed a new game to play. um, and next question in the chat was see what so this is by Magna, one of our SGDA officers. What makes a successful narrative design portfolio? Since narrative design is a super competitive field, what in a portfolio can make a student make students stand out?
First of all, hi Magda. So also it was, yeah, that's an amazing question because narrative design is one of those where like it's a niche profession in itself where like it's not as easy as just like having an animation reel or having like samples of like concept art visually in your portfolio. It depends on what it is that you want to sell to the studio. So if there's a studio where like based on the job listing, you can tell that they're looking for somebody to write cinematics or clearly have a background in graphic and script writing, then include a lot of like script samples, plays, short film samples, anything that's sort of like um, related to scripts or final draft. If you notice that it's more of a game that it's action heavy and may require more barks, like Emily mentioned, like in League of Legends, then perhaps have like a bark sheet in your portfolio that showcases like different characters and how you can adjust the tone very easily. And I would recommend for like world building also adding documentation of like your process when developing like the narrative for a project. As long as it doesn't violate any NDA, I think that would be very useful so that employers know what your process is and what it would be like working with you.
Yeah, that made me think just about how different the requirements can be for any kind of games writing or narrative design job. And something that I have noticed is that oftentimes for a games writing job, the requirements will be fairly clear. They will say, we would like several script samples. We want them to be this many pages. And if you can hit this tone in your script samples, that would be great. Whereas if you're applying to a narrative design job, they often won't have that. Sometimes they'll ask for script samples. Sometimes they won't ask for a portfolio at all. They'll just ask you to do some kind of narrative design test if you get, if they're interested in your resume, which is where having a website with some examples on it can be really, really useful because then you can screenshot like systems that you came up with as a narrative designer. And it's really hard to fit that on like a resume or something. You just don't have room. But if they specifically ask for a narrative design portfolio, or they ask for like a script sample and something that's narrative design related, what I would recommend would be like a one-pager game design document, where you are explaining a feature that you came up with. You're explaining how the system works. You say what the verbs are that the player can use, and then you explain when and where the player can use it. And maybe you provide an example. Another thing that you could do is provide a flowchart, where you're just showing like all the possible interactions that a player could do in this scene and like what the various outcomes are if you have an outcome or like choice-based game. So something like that just boiled down into a fairly simple format so that the hiring manager can read it.
Just to add something real quick, definitely like the flow charts. I've seen people that just take a screenshot of like their Twine game, but like zoomed out so that they can show their like how good they are managing branching narratives. And definitely try to include as much content and information as you can in as like the minimum amount of pages possible. So I only have a page for like my articles, one for my scripts, and then sort of articles because I did journalism before, script samples, and then the first part is just like a description of my projects using verbs like what was it that I did, what have I done, what are my skills, what programs did I use, so on and so forth. So definitely again try to, because if you look at a job posting, it will tell you how many applicants it has sometimes, and they're in the hundreds for writing jobs. So that's a hiring manager who would have to like go through like hundreds of applications. So try to like make their job easy-ish and just sort of like have as much information as you can provide without violating NDAs, so that they have all of the answers that they might have to questions of is this person capable, yes or no.
All right, I think I'll ask maybe 1 to 2 questions more, depending on how far we are by the end of the next one. But one by Fable Rain is, any advice for a solo developer for writing more heavy concepts like death or grief? I'm making a horror game project where multiple characters have to deal with death and grief, and I want to represent it realistically.
I'm literally giving a talk about this exact subject. I can't say where because I'm not allowed to yet, maybe DM me later and I can tell you where I'm giving that talk so you can attend. So I'll give a little preview of what I'm going to do. So yeah, a little bit of context. I love writing about death and grief. I don't know why. It brings me so much joy to write about sad things. I've made many games about death and grief. My last game was about death and grief. So here are the things that really help me. The first one is just like getting in the right mind space through research. So when I prepared for my game, A Taste of the Past, I read memoirs of people, like people's families dying. I watched TED Talks of people's family dying. I watched TikTok. There's this girl, she has a whole TikTok about how her parents died. And every TikTok is talking about what grief means to her and how she's been able to move on from it. And so I'll watch these things actually to get me in the right mind space and to make sure that I'm portraying these sensitive subjects in a meaningful way. But research doesn't even have to mean like reading memoirs about death and grief. It can also just mean, research into my own life, right? So if you're someone who hasn't gone through a death that's close to you, maybe you've had a hard breakup. Maybe you've had a friend that moved away, right? Maybe you had some other sense of loss in your life. And so for me, like I like to write myself into all my games. Even if I didn't experience that exact thing, I will relate what is going on in the game to my experience. So for example, like even though in A Taste of the Past, I did not, my mom is alive. I wrote about my relationship with my grandma growing up and how she used to take care of us by cooking Chinese food. I wrote about complicated, I wrote about arguments I've had with my mom growing up because May in A Taste of the Past is trying to grapple with her complicated relationship with her mother, even though her mother is gone. So there's a lot of inner conflict about how to feel about the death. My next thing is about writing with specificity. So instead of saying like, I'm sad, I try to have the character describe a situation that is sad. So yeah, instead of saying I'm sad, May in A Taste of the Past will say something like, I had to go shop for for my mom's funeral the other day. And what am I supposed to say to the store associate when she asks me, looking for anything in particular today? So like that hits a lot harder than just simply stating how the character feels. Those are my tips. I have more if you come to my talk in a few months.
Yeah, so I wanted to add on to that. This is also a topic that I'm really, really interested in. I think I mentioned I'm the editor-in-chief of an anthology basically about this topic, and several of the essays are by narrative designers and writers who worked on games that are really heavily grief and death focused. So for example, I think the essay most relevant to this question is by Kate Tremblay, who is the narrative designer on A Mortician's Tale, which is a game where you work as a funeral director. And so you are preparing a bunch of bodies for death in various different ways, whether that is burial, green burial, or cremation. And one of the most common gaming memes, I'm guessing you all are familiar with it, is press F to pay respects. And the reason why people have made fun of press F so much is because simply pressing F to pay tribute to your fallen comrade does not feel like enough of an effort, enough of an action. It feels almost like it's mocking the situation that you are in, and making light of grief and death. So the action is just not appropriate to the scene, right? And so in A Mortician's Tale, a lot of the things that you do, your actions with the bodies are you're literally preparing the bodies for death. And so that is a game where you're very like up close and personal with death. And so the actions that you can take are very like hands-on, and you end up learning a lot about the funereal industry. But if you're doing a game that's more about grief, kind of like Emily said, how is the main character, their senses, how are their senses changed by grief? So like, what do they see? What do they hear, taste, smell? Things like that. and how do the actions that they take shape how they're interacting with the environment around them. Another example of this is Depression Quest, which is it's not about grief, but it is a game about depression. And so depending on how you've progressed through the game, certain actions become crossed out and you just can't click on them based on the player character's mental state. So that's another example of kind of like where you are mentally and how you're dealing with like grief or mental health issues changes the way that you interact with the environment itself.
Those were great points with like grief. I would also recommend if anyone is making a game about grief and it is based on a very personal experience, give yourself like a lot of breaks, ground yourself, because that's a very like intimate thing to be portraying and like putting on on a, whether you're typing it or writing it down. Definitely, like if you haven't, for example, lost a parent, but perhaps a character of your game did, do some research, sort of like on how people were navigating with that loss, how they were navigating around grief. Anything by Nora McInerney. I highly recommend her TED Talks, where she lost her husband and has done TED Talks about how she doesn't move on from grief, but she moves forward with it. And I think that's like a great perspective. She's very sort of like transparent about her process, how she has been trying to heal from that loss. And her books are amazing. She's super funny, talking about that way more coherent than I am. But again, also remember to take breaks whenever you can, because grief is like a heavy subject and very personal to touch on. Um, and I hope that is of help, because I feel like Emily and Elizabeth really much covered everything there was about it.
Wait, sorry, I just want to address, someone asked where could I DM you? Emily at saunteringstudio.com is my email.
Actually, since I think we won't have too much more time left, how about you guys, first, if you feel comfortable, you can let the audience know a way to contact you if they had any more questions. Maybe a Twitter, or if you still use Twitter.
For me, you can, if you want to learn more about game development and my thoughts on games, you can follow me at Saundering Emily on Instagram. I make videos almost every single day, actually, about game dev and games I like. You can follow my studio, Saundering Studio, on Twitter. But I will say the best way to contact me would probably be to email me, Emily at saunteringstudio.com, or maybe DM me on Twitter. I don't check my Instagram DM requests because I get too many, so don't DM me there.
I'm in most social medias. Like my handle is like Saravia, so it's like 3 C's and then Aravia. I'm on Discord like Saravia and then like P. Um, I can actually write that down when sharing like other resources that we have touched on, and perhaps like share that document with everyone. I don't mind answering any questions. It's my name's Andrea Soraya Perez on LinkedIn, and I'd be more than happy to connect with folks that have questions, queries, or just seeking advice about narrative design.
So the best way to contact me if you have questions is just use the contact form on my website, which is my first name, last name, elizabethballou.squarespace.com. And I have a contact form. You can just fill that in and I'll answer you. I am on Twitter at Lizbeth Ballou, because someone already took Elizabeth Ballou. There's actually there's another Elizabeth Ballou who's like one of the world's primary mycologists. And I want to talk to her so bad about The Last of Us and whether it's like an accurate portrayal of mushrooms. Anyway, she has at Elizabeth Ballou on Twitter. So I'm at Lizbeth Ballou. I don't post that much on there. So contacting me through my website is the best way to go.
I think that you should definitely reach out to her. that would be and get back to us if on what happens with that. And also we had the cat appearance just like last year, so we have to make this a repeat thing. So all right, thank you guys so much for giving us your wisdom and for being here. And I know there's a bunch of questions left, so I will put those in the Discord channel and I'll put them in the chat for you guys if you wanted to answer them or if you had the time for that. But off to you, Jason.